The prairie was the color of a forgotten letter, yellowed, creased by time, and whispering in the wind. It stretched endlessly, quiet as a prayer too soft to be heard. Morning light bled over the land in a slow hush, setting the scrub brush aglow with a gold that looked borrowed, not owned. In front of the weather-beaten saloon in the heart of Dry Creek, she stood, small and still, as if carved from the earth itself. Dorothy May did not tremble. Her hands hung at her sides like fallen wings, fingers stained with old work and newer worry. The faded hem of her dress danced around her boots, catching the wind like a flag that had stopped belonging to any nation. Her face held no fear, only quiet, the kind of quiet that unnerved people, because it made them listen to the things inside themselves they'd rather not hear. A few men laughed too loud. Someone spit into the dust. Others avoided looking at her altogether, as though by not seeing her, they wouldn't have to admit what was happening. Her stepfather, Clay Ransom, stood beside her like a man trying to puff himself up into something he used to be. His coat was threadbare at the seams and reeked of old whiskey and dried blood. His voice was slick as oil and twice as poisonous. "Gents," he drawled, waving a hand toward Dorothy like she was a colt up for trade. "She's 16 summer strong, keeps her mouth shut, and ain't never run off. What more you want?" Dorothy stared straight ahead. Not at the men. Not at Clay. Not at the crooked sign that read "Saloon" in peeling paint. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon where the sky kissed the earth, a line she had dreamed of crossing every night for the last 3 years. A boy barely older than her stepped forward first, chewing on the inside of his lip, guilt written in the slump of his shoulders. He offered a handful of coins. Clay scoffed. "She's worth more than a week's copper, boy. This ain't a barn sale." Others followed. A man with a gold tooth and a rotted soul. Another with calloused hands and empty eyes. They didn't speak to her. They spoke about her, around her, as if she were the wind or a piece of furniture. There, but not human. The bidding was low and cruel. A woman watching from the general store porch shook her head and turned away, muttering something about shame. But she didn't stop it. No one did. And still Dorothy stood. Inside her, memories pressed like bruises. Her mama's voice, soft, always soft, saying the world could be cruel, but not always. Her mama, who had once sewn blue flowers into her Sunday dress. Her mama, who died with a fever so hot Dorothy swore it scorched the house even after the burial. After that came Clay. He wasn't kin, just a man with legal papers and a mean streak. "You're quiet," he'd said the first time they were alone. "That's good. Quiet girls don't cause trouble." She had learned to shrink, to listen more than speak, to disappear without leaving. But she had not learned to break. Not yet. The saloon door creaked open behind them. Another wave of whiskey-sweet air drifted out. A man stepped forward, stumbling a little. The sheriff. He scratched his beard, frowning like a man trying to remember if he should care. His badge caught the morning sun, but carried no warmth. "You sure this is legal, Clay?" he muttered. Clay laughed big and loud. "Hell, Sheriff, it ain't illegal. I'm her guardian, and I'm giving her a new home. Call it whatever makes your conscience lighter." The sheriff didn't reply. He turned and walked back into the dark, where the rules were blurred and the drinks were cheap. Dorothy felt something shift in the air then. It wasn't a sound. It was a silence sharper than noise. The kind of quiet that rides before a storm. Her eyes moved, just slightly, toward the edge of town, where the road bent into the canyon. A rider had appeared, tall in the saddle, moving like he'd always belonged to the land and never to any man. His horse was black as burnt wood. His skin held the color of sun-baked clay, and his braids caught the breeze like willow branches. The townsfolk noticed him late. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Apache." The word slid out like venom. A whisper, but loud enough. Taza did not stop riding. He moved through the dust and stares like a ghost. No hurry, no hesitation. He dismounted without speaking and tied his horse loosely to the post across from the saloon. Then he stood. Not a muscle moved in his face. His eyes, dark as river stone, found Dorothy, and held. She had seen warriors before. In books, in stories, in the flickers of travelers who passed through. But this man was different. He did not carry his strength like a threat. It lived in him the way trees hold water, deep, unseen, patient. Clay's voice broke the moment. "What you want, Injun?" The word hung heavy, a rusted nail in the air. Taza said nothing. He walked forward slowly, one hand at his side, the other reaching into the pouch at his belt. The crowd tensed. A few backed away. Someone whispered a prayer. Taza pulled something out and lifted it high. It wasn't a weapon. It was a feather. Long, copper-streaked, red-tipped. A red-tailed hawk feather. He stepped closer to Dorothy, never touching, and placed it gently on the ground between them. Then he stepped back. No one moved. The wind picked it up just a little, so it trembled there like something alive. Dorothy looked at it, then at Taza. Then she stepped forward. One step. Clay's face turned dark. Girl. She didn't hear him, or didn't care. She stepped again. This time she bent down, picked up the feather, turned to face the man who had bid on her soul, and said nothing at all. "No one owns me," she said, quiet as snowfall. Then she walked past him. Taza turned, mounted, reached a hand down, not commanding, but offering. Dorothy took it, and the two of them rode out of Dry Creek with the dust behind them and the sun ahead, leaving behind the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of something new. Possibility. In the stillness that followed, the feather that had once lain in the dirt danced into the wind, rising higher and higher, until it was gone. And not one man moved to stop them. The desert does not forget. It holds memory in the curve of red rock and the hush between cactus thorns, in the bones buried shallow and the wind that hums with old names. It was here that Taza rode, not as an intruder, but as one born of dust and firelight. His people knew him as one who carried silence like a song, a man who spoke little and saw much. He had seen Dorothy May before the bidding began. From the canyon ridge, where the dry grass whispered secrets, he'd watched the commotion in the town below. The people gathered like buzzards circling something already dead. Their voices drifted upward, loud, careless, the way men sound when they think no one greater is listening. But it wasn't their laughter that caught his attention. It was her stillness. She stood among them like a lone mesquite tree in a drought, not bowed, not broken, but still terribly still, in a way that struck him as sacred, like she was holding the world together with nothing but her spine and her breath. Taza did not believe in interference. The white man's towns were not his business. He'd learned too many times that when you step between a snake and its prey, both will turn on you. But something about the girl rooted him in place. He watched her silence, and then he felt it, the slow churn of something awakening. Not pity, recognition. Many years ago, before his eyes had gone so sharp and his voice so soft, Taza had loved a girl with a laugh like summer rain. She had died before the snow came, and her absence had grown in him like a hollow place no sound could fill. Since then he had ridden alone, not lonely, but apart. Until now. Now there was this girl with dust on her cheekbones and defiance in her bones, and her quietness called to his. When he rode into town, he did not do so to claim her. He came to offer a choice. That mattered, because he had known what it meant to have no choice. To be traded, betrayed, hunted. He had known what it meant to be turned into a shadow in someone else's story. So when he stepped forward, when he laid the feather between them, he wasn't offering salvation. He was offering recognition. And when she took it, when her fingers closed around that single thread of flight, he felt something shift inside him that hadn't moved in years. They rode together without speaking. The horses' hooves drummed a rhythm against the cracked earth. The sun began its slow descent, casting their shadows long behind them. Dorothy didn't ask where they were going, and Taza didn't say. She rode with the stillness of someone who knew that direction wasn't about destination, but about leaving behind. By the time the town was no longer a smudge behind them, night was unrolling across the sky. Taza made camp in a shallow hollow near the rim of a bluff. He moved with practiced ease, no wasted motion. Dorothy watched him build a small fire from dry brush and place stones around it. She kept her distance. not from fear, but from caution finely honed. He offered her jerky and a gourd of water. She accepted both without thanks or question. They sat on opposite sides of the flame. Taza studied her through the flicker of light. She was younger than he'd first thought. Not in years, but in the way her eyes carried too many storms too soon. She held herself like someone used to waiting. For pain, for escape, for nothing at all. He said her name softly, as if trying it on his tongue. She looked up. Nodded once. Dorothy. She didn't ask for his. Names didn't matter yet. What mattered was space. Breath. Time. The fire crackled between them like an old friend who needed no explanation. Taza leaned back, resting against a flat stone warmed by the day's heat. He looked to the stars, pointed with one hand to the eastern rise. That one, he said quietly, is the heron. It flies where rivers have no name. Dorothy followed his finger. She didn't respond, but her shoulders eased just slightly. They spoke little at night, but it was enough. At dawn, she woke to the scent of juniper and the sound of wind tracing the canyon walls. Taza had already caught water from a spring nearby. He handed her a damp cloth, a small gesture that felt like more. She wiped her face, and for the first time in years, the grime came off without being replaced by fresh tears. They traveled by silence and sun. Taza did not press. He taught without teaching, pointed out animal tracks, let her ride ahead when she pleased. At night, he spoke of stars, not people, of wind, not wounds. And Dorothy, who had forgotten how to speak without defending herself, began to listen. Days passed. A rhythm formed, simple, unspoken, sacred. She learned the names of plants. He watched her walk with more weight in her step and less in her heart. Once, by a river, she laughed, a sound so brief it startled the birds. Taza only nodded, but later, she caught him humming to himself beneath his breath. But even in the stillness, the past followed. One night, as they camped beneath a sky thick with stars, she turned to him. "Why did you help me?" Her voice was hoarse, raw from disuse. Taza didn't look at her right away. He placed another stick on the fire. Let the embers glow brighter. "Because you didn't scream," he said. She frowned. "I thought maybe you couldn't." Dorothy swallowed. The fire danced in her eyes. No one would have heard. Taza nodded. A silence passed between them, full of shared understanding. Then he said gently, "When no one listens, the earth still does. It remembers every footstep, every silence, even the ones we bury." She watched him then, not as a stranger, but as someone who had carried silence too. Taza did not smile, but his eyes held warmth now. Not the kind that burns, the kind that stays when the fire is gone. That night, sleep came easier. But morning brought dust. In the distance, low and steady, the sound of riders. Taza stood before the sun fully rose. He placed his hand to the earth, feeling the tremor. Dorothy watched him, waiting. He looked to her. Someone's coming. She didn't ask who. She already knew. But she did not pale. She did not flinch. Instead, she stood beside him, not behind. And that, Taza thought, was the beginning of everything. The canyon took them in like a cradle carved by time, its rust-colored walls rising high on either side, softening the wind and quieting the sky. It was not a place meant to be found. Even the birds sang low here, as if they knew it was a place for healing, not noise. Taza led Dorothy to a narrow trail few had walked. It wound through clusters of prickly pear and cottonwood, past boulders split by old lightning and old stories. At the end stood a small shelter, half cave, half home, hidden beneath a ledge of sandstone. Smoke had once curled from the smooth stone chimney, and the earth bore the shape of someone who had lived gently here. He did not ask if she wanted to stay. He simply waited, hands still, eyes steady, until she stepped into the quiet with her own 2 feet. Inside, the walls were streaked with ochre and charcoal, where someone long ago had painted rising suns and animals mid-stride. There was a sleeping mat woven from yucca fiber, a hearth blackened by memory. A small bundle of herbs hung upside down from the rafters. Dorothy moved carefully, her body remembering what it was to not be watched, to not be weighed. Each step felt like a decision. She touched nothing, but her breathing changed. Slower, lower in her ribs. Taza unpacked the supplies in silence. Dried beans, a few apples, a thick fur rolled tightly. He offered her none of it with words. Just gestures, just presence. It was more than she'd been given in years. He slept outside the first night, under the overhang. The stars above him turned like old friends. Dorothy did not sleep well, not because of fear, but because her body was still braced for what did not come. She waited for footsteps, harsh commands, the snap of anger in the dark. But all that came was the slow crackle of firewood and the breath of the canyon's wind through the stones. By morning, she had not cried, but her hands had stopped shaking. The days fell into rhythm. Taza hunted and returned with rabbit or quail. Dorothy learned to skin them with steady hands. At first she did it to help. Later, to reclaim something unnamed. The act of turning death into sustenance made her feel like maybe survival didn't always have to come wrapped in shame. He taught her the language of plants, how to crush mesquite pods into flour, how to boil desert willow bark for pain. She didn't ask how he knew. She knew better than to ask a man why he remembered what others had forgotten. In return, she shared pieces of herself, not all at once, but like a creek breaking free of frost. She told him about her mother's singing, soft as corn silk, and how she used to braid Dorothy's hair in silence just before supper. She told him how clay came later, loud and sharp and always looming, how he called her a burden one night, and how that word had wrapped around her ribs ever since, like a belt that wouldn't come loose. Taza didn't interrupt. He never said he was sorry. He never said she was strong. He just listened with his whole body, as if her words were wind patterns he needed to memorize. That, she realized, was what made her begin to bloom. Not praise, not rescue, but recognition. He saw her, and in seeing her, gave her back the right to see herself. On the 6th day, she ventured alone down to the stream. The water was cold and clear, and it startled her skin awake. She washed her face with cupped hands and watched her reflection ripple. She did not look like someone owned anymore. She looked like someone learning her own shape again. When she returned, Taza was carving wood by the fire. He glanced up, his eyes calm. She sat near him, not close, but not far. After a while, he held up the object. It was a small figure, the form of a bird in flight. She traced it with her eyes, not her hands. "It's for the feather," she said. He nodded. The silence that followed was soft. That night, Dorothy sat by the fire long after he had lain down. She watched the flames flicker against the sandstone, casting long shadows on the wall like ghosts made gentle. She wondered aloud, almost to herself, what makes a person safe? Taza's voice came from the dark, low and even. Not what they promise, what they don't take. Dorothy thought of all the things that had been taken from her: choice, voice, softness. And how now, with him, they had begun to return, slowly, like spring thaw. On the 8th day, she laughed again. It was after she burned the bread she tried to bake in the coals. It was dry and bitter and black as a boot. Taza chewed solemnly through the first bite and nodded, deadpan, crunchy. She laughed, sharp and startled, and then kept laughing until her ribs ached. And he smiled, not with his mouth, but with the stillness that filled the space between them. Later that evening, a hawk circled above. Dorothy watched it glide without effort, riding the heat of the canyon. She thought of the feather, now tucked into the folded linen beside her bedroll, and felt the weight of it again, not heavy, but grounding. She looked over at Taza. "I want to stay," she said. He did not answer quickly. "Then, you already are." The wind picked up then, as if agreeing. But even in this gentle place, something lingered, a pressure beneath the peace. Dorothy knew it in the way her body occasionally flinched at loud cracks of wood, or how her breath caught when shadows moved too fast. Healing was not forgetting. It was remembering differently. And now, as the days stretched longer and the canyon welcomed their steps like returning drums, Dorothy felt something else inside her waking. Not fear, not flight, but readiness. One night, while gathering firewood, she heard the distant echo of hooves across the plain. She turned to Taza, who was already watching the horizon. "They're looking," she said. His jaw tightened. Not with panic, with knowing. "They will come." "But we won't run," she said, steady. This time he did smile. "No," he said. "We will stand." And in her chest, something broke open. Not pain, purpose. Because shelter, she had learned, was not just a place where danger could not reach. It was where courage began to speak. The ghosts came with the wind, just as Taza said they would. No rattling chains, no groans in the night, only hoofbeats like distant thunder and the smell of dust carried from the past. It was early, just past the pink light of dawn, when Dorothy felt it first. A ripple in the air, a shift in the quiet that no birdsong could mend. Taza stood already at the edge of the canyon trail, scanning the horizon with the stillness of a tree rooted in a storm. His hand rested near the knife at his belt, not in threat, but in memory. Beside him, Dorothy saw it too, 5 riders, dark against the morning light, moving with purpose. Not fast, not slow. The way men move when they believe justice is on their side, even when they've never known its shape. Clay Ransom had returned for her. She could feel it, not in the sight of the riders or the grit in the wind, but in her ribs, where fear used to live. Except now, there was no trembling, only breath, only the cold clarity that comes when you know you've already survived the worst. Taza didn't speak. He placed a hand gently on Dorothy's shoulder. His touch was like stone warmed by sun, steady, grounding, asking nothing. "They'll come to the ridge," he said after a while, voice low. "That's where they'll expect to see us run." "But we won't," Dorothy replied calm. And they didn't. Instead, they moved deeper into the canyon, where the cliffs narrowed and the old roots twisted like questions. There, in a hollow half covered by vines and silence, lived an old woman with hair white as river foam and skin drawn tight as rawhide over bone. She wore turquoise beads around her throat and smelled of dried sage and something older. Taza called her auntie, though there was no blood between them. She looked at Dorothy with eyes so sharp they seemed to read the parts of her still hidden. "Ah," she said, nodding once. "One who stands when she has reason to run." Dorothy bowed her head, unsure why the compliment hurt more than it pleased. The old woman fed them without fuss, cornbread with wild honey, strong tea boiled with cedar bark. She spoke little, but her presence filled the space like smoke, curling into corners, coaxing out the cold. That night, Dorothy lay beside the fire while Taza and the old woman spoke in their native tongue, low and rhythmic. She didn't understand the words, but she knew their meaning. It was the language of people who'd lost more than they could name, who had decided to live anyway. She dreamed of her mother that night. Not in pain, not sick, just braiding Dorothy's hair and humming. When she woke, her cheeks were wet, and she didn't wipe them. By mid-morning, the riders were near. Taza left at dawn to watch from the ridge. Dorothy stayed behind with Auntie, who sat cross-legged weaving dried grasses into a coil. "They will try to make you doubt your strength," the woman said, her voice rough as cedar bark. "But they cannot take what you do not give." Dorothy nodded. Her hands were steady now, even when wrapped around a canteen or smoothing the hem of her dress. When Taza returned, he said the men had stopped 2 miles out, camped near a broken cottonwood, watching, waiting. "They think we'll come crawling," he said. Dorothy's mouth twisted into something that could have been a smile. "They've never seen what standing looks like." The next day, a boy came. No older than 12, brown-eyed and barefoot, his shirt torn at the sleeve. He wandered into the canyon like a shadow and stopped near the fire, saying nothing. Dorothy crouched down beside him. "You hungry?" she asked. He nodded once, eyes fixed on the bread in her hand. She gave him the whole piece. Only later did Taza tell her the boy was mute, hadn't spoken since his village burned. He brought messages in movement, in silence. This time, the message was simple. The riders had called for the sheriff. They meant to take her by force or law, whichever bent easier. Taza leaned against the canyon wall, arms crossed. "They will come tomorrow." Dorothy looked at the canyon's mouth, at the crooked trail that led to her freedom, and now threatened to carry danger straight into its heart. "Let them," she said. That night, she did not sleep. She sat by the fire until the embers sank low, thinking of the life she'd left. The girl who once kept her voice in her throat like a bird afraid to sing. That girl was still inside her, but quieter now, not because she'd been silenced, but because she was listening. Listening to the woman she was becoming. At dawn, Dorothy dressed in the same calico dress she wore the day Taza had offered her the feather. It was faded now, torn at the hem, but she wore it like armor. She braided her hair herself. And she waited. The riders came as the sun crowned the horizon. Clay Ransom at the front, all puffed up like a man too used to winning by shouting. The sheriff beside him, hat tilted low, face unreadable. Behind them, two others Dorothy didn't know, strangers, armed and grim. They reached the canyon mouth and stopped, squinting into the shadow. Taza stepped forward first. Alone, his shadow long behind him, his voice a calm that refused to rise. "You have no right here." Clay laughed. Loud, ugly. "She's mine by law." Dorothy stepped into view then, walking until she stood beside Taza. She did not hide, did not waver. "I'm not property." The sheriff shifted in his saddle, looking between them. "She's been gone weeks, Taza," he said cautiously. "They say she was taken." Dorothy's chin lifted. "I left." Clay's lip curled. "She don't know what she's saying." Dorothy cut him off. "I know what silence is. I lived with it too long. And I know what safety feels like now. It doesn't sound like yelling. Doesn't smell like whiskey. It doesn't bruise." The wind caught her hair and lifted it like a banner. The sheriff looked down at the ground. "This place ain't in our jurisdiction," he muttered. "If she stays here, it ain't my concern." Clay spat into the dirt. "You cowards." But the others behind him had already started to turn their horses. Dorothy looked at her stepfather then, really looked, and what she saw was not power. It was a man whose voice only carried weight when no one stood to answer back. She stepped forward once, close enough that he flinched. "You're going to leave now," she said, quiet and steady, "because the only thing you own is your shame." Then she turned her back on him, not out of arrogance, but out of grace, and she walked away. Taza watched her come toward him. Light slanting behind her like the sky was honoring her courage. His hand brushed hers, brief and wordless. They stood side by side as the riders vanished into the dust. Later, when the fire was lit and the stars returned, Auntie handed Dorothy a feather. "Not hawk this time, but dove." "For peace," she said. Dorothy ran her fingers along the soft edge, then tucked it into her braid. She had not been saved. She had been seen. And she had saved herself. The canyon held its breath. After the riders turned back, days passed in stillness. Dorothy moved through them with quiet purpose, not like someone hiding, but like someone learning how to live without waiting for footsteps behind her. She mended the mat near the hearth, swept the dust from the doorway, and gathered dried mesquite pods in a woven basket. Each act was small, but it steadied her, like stitching the pieces of herself back together with thread made of sunlight and silence. Taza watched, not as a guardian, not as a savior, but as a witness. There was reverence in his stillness, the kind that comes from recognizing strength disguised as survival. He did not praise her, nor did he intrude on her rebuilding. He simply stayed. And still, they both knew something lingered. Clay Ransom had not left out of defeat. He'd left simmering, a man robbed of control, and men like him didn't fade into quiet. They burned. On the 10th day, the sky changed. The wind came harder, pressing against the canyon walls with urgency. The kind of wind that carried something behind it. The birds flew lower. Even Auntie's goats refused to leave their shelter. Taza knelt beside the fire ring that evening and scattered cedar into the embers. The smoke curled blue and bitter. Dorothy stood at the mouth of the shelter, watching the fading light stretch long across the earth. "He's coming," she said. Taza nodded. No surprise. No panic. Just a truth finally arriving. That night, Dorothy didn't sleep. She braided her hair tightly, tucked the dove feather into it, and laid out the small knife Taza had given her weeks ago. She didn't expect to use it. She didn't want to. But she was no longer the girl who needed saving. And she would not be taken again. At dawn, The fire was already lit. Taza sat beside it, sharpening an arrowhead with slow, deliberate strokes. He looked up when Dorothy emerged, wrapped in her worn shawl, eyes sharp with morning resolve. "He won't come alone," she said. "No," Taza agreed. "But he'll lead." They didn't speak after that. Words felt unnecessary now. By mid-morning, the riders returned. But this time, there were fewer. 3 men. Clay among them. His horse kicked up a storm of dust as he approached, face shadowed by a wide hat, rage flickering behind narrowed eyes. One hand gripped the reins. The other, the butt of a rifle. He didn't call out. Didn't ask. He just dismounted, boots cracking dry earth, and walked straight into the canyon with the conviction of a man who believed violence was still a language people respected. Dorothy stepped forward before Taza could. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shake. "You already lost," she said. Clay tilted his head, mocking. "You think standing out here with some redskin makes you a woman now?" "No," she said softly. "But walking away from you did." His mouth twitched, not with humor, but something uglier. "You always were ungrateful. And you always needed someone smaller than you to feel big," Dorothy replied. "But I'm not small anymore." Behind Clay, the 2 hired men shifted uneasily. One glanced toward Taza, who stood like a stone, bow slung across his back, unreadable. "Don't do this," Dorothy said, almost gently. "Whatever you think you're proving, no one's watching." Clay's eyes narrowed. "You think you can talk your way out of this? You think hiding with savages makes you clean?" Taza stepped forward then. Not fast, not loud. He walked between Dorothy and Clay and stood, a full head taller, eyes level with the man who had brought this storm. No weapon raised. No threat made. Just presence. Taza opened his hand slowly. In his palm, the red-tailed hawk feather. Clay stared at it, baffled. "What the hell's that?" Dorothy answered, voice low. "Freedom." Clay scoffed and raised the rifle. It all happened in the space between heartbeats. Taza moved, not toward the rifle, but toward the truth. He stepped into Clay's line of sight, hand still open, feather still offered. Clay hesitated. A crack in the anger, a splinter of confusion. He faltered. But then pride screamed louder than reason. He swung the rifle at Taza's head. The butt connected with bone. Taza dropped. Dorothy did not scream. She ran. Not away, forward. Straight into Clay with all the weight of a storm behind her. She shoved him back, and they both went down hard, dust rising like smoke. The rifle clattered out of reach. Clay roared, tried to twist free, but Dorothy had wrapped herself around him like fire. Wild, unrelenting. "I'm not yours," she said, teeth gritted. "I never was." He struck her, once, twice, but she held. And then there were other hands pulling him off. The 2 hired men, shouting now, dragging Clay back. One of them dropped him like a carcass, chest heaving. "We didn't sign up for this," he growled. "She ain't chattel." Clay thrashed, but his voice had lost its edge. Taza sat upright slowly, a gash at his temple, blood painting his cheek. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't move toward Clay. Instead, he looked at Dorothy. She stood there, battered, breathing hard, face streaked with blood and dust, but unbroken. More than unbroken. Risen. Taza rose to his feet. The feather was still in his hand. He crossed to Dorothy, brushed the blood gently from her brow with his fingers. She winced, but didn't turn away. The 2 of them stood, fire behind them, sky above, and for the first time, no one between them. Clay sat in the dirt, breathing heavy, eyes hollow. "You'll regret this," he spat. Dorothy crouched, not to threaten, but to meet him eye to eye. "No," she said. "You will." She turned away, and this time she did not look back. The other men rode off, without another word. And Clay Ransom, who had always believed he could bend others by force, sat alone with his rage and the silence he once demanded. That night, the fire burned higher than before. Auntie brought out a small pouch of crushed herbs and an old chant, humming low as she pressed cloth to Taza's wound. Dorothy sat beside him, hand on his knee, not speaking. There was no need. When the fire crackled its soft rhythm, Dorothy reached into her braid and pulled out the dove feather. She held it between them. For peace, she said. Taza placed the hawk feather beside it. For flight, he replied. They watched the flames rise together, two lives no longer running, no longer hiding, no longer silent. And as the wind turned gentle and the stars settled into their places, Dorothy leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, as much to herself as to him, "I am free." The fire answered with a hiss of sap and a dance of sparks. Some stories end in escape, but the best ones? They end in becoming.